And hello, friends, and we welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable Channel 4. I'm Eliot Parker, your host for this program, as we continue to profile local authors, writers, and publishers in our region. And we have another distinguished author from the Tri-State region with us today, and her name is Marie Manilla. And Marie Manilla is a graduate of Marshall University and West Virginia University, and also a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, the prestigious Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa. She teaches English off and on at Marshall University, and her books include Still Life with Plums, short stories, published by West Virginia University Press, Shrapnel, a novel, and the upcoming The Patron Saint of Ugly, a novel forthcoming from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in spring 2014. She was from Huntington, spent some time living and writing in Texas, and now is back in Huntington writing and teaching in the region. And so with that, we welcome Marie Manilla to our program. Marie, good to see you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eliot. Good to see you too.
So I guess one of the first questions we always like to ask our writers here on the program is, how did you get started in writing, and did that come about early on in your life, or was it something later on in life you got interested in?
I was a late bloomer. I was a very late bloomer. I always loved to read, but my first job was as a graphic artist in Houston, Texas. And when I moved to Texas, I became an avid reader. I always loved to read, but I became a voracious reader, especially short stories. So I remember reading one in a magazine one day, and I kind of smugly and naively thought, well, I can write a story at least as good as this. So I tried to write one story and another, and that's all it took. That's all it took. And then I understood that I really needed to learn the craft because it's much more difficult than I thought. So I started taking classes, and I eventually moved back to West Virginia and got that MA at Marshall and then the Writers Workshop. And here I am, about 20 years later, so here I am.
I think that's one thing that we hear a lot of writers talk about so often is, if you're interested in the craft of writing, or if you're thinking about developing that craft in some way, being a good reader is so important in the process. And you had mentioned that being a good reader and being a voracious reader was something that helped you. Do you feel like that's pretty universal for folks that are interested in writing, or maybe thinking about picking this up as either a hobby or a career, is to read a lot, and maybe read in the genre that you like, but also read in other genres that maybe you don't like?
Right. It's crucial for would-be writers to read. You have to read like a maniac. And it is beneficial to read widely. I love mystery. I love science fiction. My passion is literary fiction, so I read a lot of that in my graduate studies. But you've got to learn how the masters do it well so that you can try to figure out how they created their stories and their novels. You look for the way they constructed their pieces and then follow them as a guide. So read, read, read.
Absolutely. Your first book, as we mentioned a moment ago, Still Life with Plums, short stories, which was published by West Virginia University Press. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that book came about and really where the stories from that collection came from?
Sure. As I said, I lived in Texas for 7 years and started writing in Texas. So when I was in Texas, naturally a lot of the stories were set in Texas. But what I found was that characters from West Virginia kept popping in and peopling the stories. And then when I moved back to West Virginia, I started writing with West Virginia as a setting and West Virginia characters, but people from Texas kept popping into those stories. So I discovered that that was a fascination with me, how similar Texans and West Virginians are. So if you read the collection, you're going to see a lot of Texans and West Virginians and Latinos as well. What I also learned early on, because I wrote almost exclusively short stories for about 10 years, is that it's very hard to get a collection out. I was getting stories published in journals around the country, but it's very difficult to get a collection out. Publishers want a novel. So I had the collection in various forms that I had been trying to publish for probably a decade. And finally I got just the magic form. I got the magic 10 stories that I think worked really well together, and WVU fell in love with it, so they published it. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for them. So they put out a beautiful book.
Yes, they certainly did. And you mentioned short stories being difficult to get into a collection. We haven't really talked a lot about publishing yet on our program, this being our first season. But I think a lot of writers, when they set out to write, if they're interested in doing maybe fiction or nonfiction start with a short story. Is that really, when you think about tying in what you read to becoming a writer, where writers you think should start in that process, playing with the short story form and looking at that as an opportunity to get started?
I don't know if I would prescribe that necessarily. I have heard it said that people start with poems and then they graduate to short stories and then they graduate to novels, and I just think that's wrong, because poetry is so hard. And I write short stories, novels, I've written plays, I've written a screenplay. I have attempted poetry, but it's just a form I just cannot grasp. So I think you just start where your passion is. I just loved reading short stories. I was in love with Raymond Carver and Ann Beattie and Ann Tyler, and I just loved their stories so much, Hemingway. That's where I kind of gravitated first. And then I realized I needed a larger world for my characters. In fact, the first chapter of Shrapnel was going to be just a short story. I wanted another short story where a character from Texas moves to West Virginia with his head filled with stereotypes, and I wanted to explore that. So I wrote the first chapter, and I realized that I needed a world, a whole world, so it developed into a novel. So I would say start wherever your passion is. Whatever you love to read, that's what you should start with.
You mentioned Shrapnel, and we'll talk about that too in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But I think anybody who hasn't read or maybe has read Still Life with Plums short stories, I think one of the great features and techniques that you work into that, as well as Shrapnel, and I imagine that's also going to be featured in The Patron Saint of Ugly when it's published in spring of 2014, is strong characters. All your short stories in Shrapnel have strong characters, and these are strong characters that readers will probably love and love to hate over the course of the collection of short stories. But even in Shrapnel, you have some very lovable characters, but you also have some characters that sort of fall on the periphery of that love-hate reader reaction. Right. Is that something that you would identify maybe as a stylistic technique that you like to do, or does it just sort of end up happening organically as you're writing the stories?
I think that is the definition of literary fiction. Literary fiction is what I'm drawn to, and that is basically character-driven, and you just plumb the character's psychology. So that's what I'm interested in as a reader, and that's naturally what I'm interested in as a writer. But that doesn't mean that genre fiction like horror or Western or science fiction can't also be character-driven. But I pretty much solely just explore the psychology of the characters. I love to put them into difficult situations to see how they're going to get out of it alive or not get out of it alive. I love characters that are fully realized. They're not wholly good or wholly evil. They're a combination of both, because that's what the human condition is about. So in my fiction, I'm really just exploring the human condition in all its loveliness and in all of our failings too.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit too about Shrapnel now. We touched on that briefly. A novel set about an older gentleman who's grown up in Texas and now is sort of being extrapolated against his will to some extent back to Huntington, where his daughter lives, and she's a college professor, I believe at Marshall.
Right.
And so he sort of comes back against his will, and there's a whole process of self-discovery, or sort of reacquainting himself with the family. He's had connections with them before, but he really sees kind of their day-to-day environment in which they live. And talk to us a little bit about him. He's a wonderful character named Bing.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about him and his journey through that story, through that book.
Bing Butler is the main character of Shrapnel, and he's a crusty soul. I met so many men like Bing when I lived in Texas, and I know there are men like Bing everywhere. He's a retired welder. He's a World War II veteran. He is a bit of a racist, sexist, homophobe, I have to admit, because I met a lot of men like him in Texas and everywhere. And I wanted to understand what made him tick. And that's why I write. I write to understand the world. So I wanted to slip into his skin for a while to see if I could figure out not only what made him tick, but if I could make him a compassionate character. Because often when you meet people who are rough around the edges, you want to make them all evil and you want to hate them. And I'm like, I don't want to hate him. I want to understand him. So he comes to West Virginia because his health is failing and he has to move in with his daughter. But he comes with a head filled with all the Appalachian stereotypes you can think of. He really, even though he knows his daughter and son-in-law teach at Marshall, he still thinks, I'm going to live up a holler somewhere. It's going to be rough. I don't know what they're going to feed me. So when he comes to Huntington, which is the second largest city in the state. It's an urban center. He is confronted with a world he never expected. He's confronted with people he never expected to meet who are more educated than him. Suddenly he feels like the poor relation. Everything he thought he knew is turned upside down. So throughout the novel, all of the stereotypes he held are challenged, and some are confirmed and some are obliterated. So it was an interesting experiment to write this novel.
And let me ask you a little bit about titles, because we hear that being so important in short stories, in short fiction, in novels, this concept of having a title that gets the reader's attention. Yeah. And I know when this book was coming out and when you had announced that it was coming out, I thought Shrapnel, wow, that immediately pulled me in to that, as did Still Life with Plums with your short story collection, because I'm a reader that always wants to see how does the title fit into the literary work. Right. How does the word shrapnel, or that idea of shrapnel, fit into the novel?
Well, the novel is about the legacy of war in 3 generations of the Bing Butler family. He was in World War II, his son was in Vietnam, and his grandson wants to join the service for the Gulf War. It's set in 2002. The shrapnel that I am exploring is really the emotional shrapnel that this family has been carrying, because they lost one of their members in Vietnam, but Bing and his daughter and his wife, they never fully addressed it. So they've been carrying this emotional shrapnel for 30 years. So the novel is really an opportunity for Bing and his daughter to come to terms with the son Roger's death. They've been placing blame perhaps on each other, so this is an opportunity for him to grow. It really is a coming of age story for Bing. What I know now about the title and the cover, and though I love the title, Shrapnel, and I do love the cover, what I now know is that together they misrepresent the book a bit, because people look at it and think it's going to be a real war novel. We're going to go into battles, we're going to see Hamburger Hill or whatever. Right. And it's really a character-driven family saga about the effects of war on this family. And it mirrors a lot of families that have had children who have gone to service. So, though, as I said, I love the title and the cover. Together they do misrepresent the book just a tiny bit.
So let's talk about your upcoming novel that's going to be published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in spring of 2014, The Patron Saint of Ugly. Tell us a little bit about that. And what another great title there too, like with Shrapnel and Still Life with Plums.
I love it. I love it. And I was nervous that they wouldn't keep the title, but I think so far they are, because they're using it in publicity, so I think that's the title, and I love it so much. It's another novel set in West Virginia, but I made up the town. It's called Sweetwater. But it's based on the area of Huntington, West Virginia, where I grew up, called Gallagher Village. And we lived on a hill kind of behind the village, and all roads led to Gallagher Village, where there was the movie theater and the pharmacy with the soda fountain and the Catholic church and school where I went when I grew up. So my town is structured pretty much like that. But the main character is a woman born with port wine birthmarks all over her body that look like a map of the world. And her Italian grandmother insists that she is a descendant of a 16th century saint who was similarly modeled. So the whole novel is her dictating a series of tapes to an archbishop who is investigating her on the Vatican's behalf. And I love her so much because she's a real smart aleck. So I get to poke a lot of fun at a lot of different things in the book, but it's really it's Garnet Ferrari as the narrator. But I love her growth. She has a lot of tragedy in her life, but there's a lot of comic relief. I even have that in Shrapnel and Still Life with Plums. I like dark humor. So there's a lot of dark humor in the book too. But I'm in love with the characters. I'm in love with her story. And the novel's set in 1975, but it goes back to the turn of the century, and we get to hear her grandmother's story back in Sicily. And then the novel is propelled forward a little bit. But it's a family saga with my roots, because I'm Italian and I'm Irish and I'm Catholic, so I got to weave all those together in The Patron Saint of Ugly.
Fantastic. Well, We're certainly looking forward to that coming out. I think it's going to be a great novel. Before we have you read an excerpt of some of your writing, I think you're going to read something from Shrapnel. If people are interested in getting a copy of Still Life with Plums, short stories, or Shrapnel, or possibly the upcoming Patron Saint of Ugly when it comes out in the spring, where can they go to get copies of your work?
Well, Still Life with Plums is from West Virginia University Press, so they can go to that website website if they want to, or Amazon.com or Pals.com, or your favorite local bookstore. I'm sure they'd order it for you. Shrapnel was published by River City Publishing, and you can also go to their website or Amazon or ask your favorite bookstore to order it for you.
Well, that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.